It's a delight to introduce my friend and colleague, Cathy Devine. Cathy's research focuses on the human rights of girls and women in sport. It focuses on domestic and international sports policy. And at the moment, she's working on the human rights deficits for females that are manifested in the eligibility criteria which privilege transgender inclusion over female inclusion. She argues that fairness and inclusion are aligned rather than in tension, and that the human rights of females in sport depend on fair eligibility criteria which acknowledge human sexual dimorphism. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Cathy and ask you to give your presentation, Cathy.
Thanks very much, John. Lovely to be here and lovely to almost but not quite see everybody. Anyway, just a little bit about me. I've been involved in sport all my life. I've coached gymnastics, trampoline and windsurfing, including residential weeks for women windsurfers. I've worked at the UK's National Coaching Foundation, now UK Coaching, for 5 years, with responsibility for developing women coaches, and at the UK's National Federation of Women's Institutes as head of sport for 3 years. I was on the organising committee for the first International Women in Sport Conference in 1994 here in the UK, organised by the Sports Council and supported by the IOC. And I'm a member of 2 climbing clubs, the Carabiner Mountaineering Club and the Climbers Club. So today I'm going to talk mainly about the impact on female athletes and sports participants of including trans women, biological males, in female sport categories at both elite and participatory levels. And for the philosophers amongst you, my work is framed by political philosophy, that is justice and rights, rather than moral philosophy, that is values, which, as John indicated, I believe the 2 values often kind of argued over, inclusion and fairness, are actually aligned, which is why I talk about rights and justice. I argue that the problem that sports bodies have is that they have tried to balance values, inclusion and fairness, rather than address justice and rights. And further, they've elevated the inclusion and human rights of male transgender athletes, trans women, over fairness for and the human rights of female athletes. So therefore, this is a conflict, a rights conflict that, as far as females are concerned, orientates around sex. And so I argue this is a rights conflict, not a values conflict. My work uses the feminist political philosophy of Pateman, Lister and Fraser, which offers a conceptual context in which to assess the extent to which girls and women have justice and equal rights in sport. And so I ask, following distinguished political philosopher Hannah Arendt, do females have the right to have rights in sport? Are female rights human rights? And should gender identity override sex in sport policy? So here's a list of my publications. And my paper, London 2012 Olympic Legacy, a Big Sporting Society, was published in 2012 and looked at 3 generations of human rights. In 2015, my paper, Sex, Sport and Justice, Reframing the Who of Citizenship and the What of Justice in European and UK Sport Policy, used political philosophy to ask what would constitute justice for girls and women in sport. And then in 2018, my paper, Sex, Sport and Money, ironically, I do kind of think back on those 2 papers and think, would those titles even now be allowed? Because, you know, the titles both include sex. But Sex, Sport and Money, Voice, Choice and Distributive Justice in England, Scotland and Wales. And it found that despite the requirements of the 2010 Equality Act, the sport and physical activity choices of males were disproportionately funded by the sports councils at the expense of female choices. The 2 papers I wrote last year looked at Female Olympians' views of the 2015 IOC Transgender Guidelines, and the second one on the impact of gender identity eligibility criteria on female sports participation. So on to the first 2021 article I published. So my paper, Female Olympians' Voices, asked something very simple. What do female elite Olympic athletes think about the IOC transgender guidelines? I was utterly astonished, kind of, I suppose, but not quite, that they had not been asked about eligibility criteria for their own female categories, and that those who had spoken up were repeatedly called transphobic bigots. This cannot be right. If you're developing policy, you need to hear from all stakeholders. And so I asked 19 female Olympians for their views. Many were the best in the world, household names, and between them attended all Olympic Games from 1976 to 2016. 3 attended Rio and 5 London, and I collected my data before Tokyo. And they have 6 gold, 2 silver and 1 bronze Olympic medals and additional top 6 placings, together with many additional World Championship titles, medals and records. My main findings were that these Olympians thought, 1, female and transgender athletes should both be fairly included in elite sport. 2, there is not enough scientific evidence to show no competitive advantage for trans women. And 3, the IOC should revisit the rules and scientific evidence for transgender inclusion in female categories. And 4, of real concern, they could not discuss this issue without being accused of transphobia. This was the majority of them. And even their governing bodies silenced them on this issue. So here are some of their comments. Olympian 1, quote, new guidelines do not level the playing field or protect equal opportunities for female athletes to achieve successes. Our human rights to equal opportunities are not being protected. Olympian 2, athletes are wary. I have been abused on social media for commenting on this issue. The abuse is generally vitriolic and aggressive. And Olympian 3, why don't women matter? I'm in support of people living however they choose, but to try and say this wouldn't disadvantage women in sport is a lie. I concluded, therefore, that firstly, female athletes are recipients of coercive decisions regarding their own categories and female bodies. 2, given they felt unable to speak without being termed transphobic, the wider female athlete population may feel similarly silenced, misrecognised and misrepresented. And presciently, this has very much turned out to be the case. 3, these Olympians did not accept that fairness for females should be subordinated to inclusion for trans women, and consequently regarded the IOC guidelines as unfit for purpose. And these were the 2015 guidelines, and we've now got guidelines that I'm sure they'd consider even more unfit for purpose, but we'll come to that. 4, fairness for female athletes should celebrate the fastest, highest and strongest female athletes at elite and Olympic levels. That is what the dedicated female category is designed to do. I was delighted that this paper was ranked number 5 of over 200,000 papers in sociology for 2021, based on the altmetric or reach score. In that, there was huge interest in it. And I think it was probably the first piece of research that actually allowed female athletes to speak. World Rugby published theirs in 2020, but I collected my data in 2019. Anyway, since my survey, there's been quite a bit of additional work with female athletes, and all the evidence shows they do not consent to the inclusion of trans women with male advantage in female categories. And that's not a pejorative view, it's just purely based on the scientific evidence in terms of retained male advantage. So, for example, in the US, more than 3,000 athletes, including almost 300 members of the US Olympic, Paralympic and national teams, are among 5,500 stakeholders who signed a petition calling on world sports authorities to acknowledge that sex matters and for categorisation based on biological sex. And further, the sports bodies that have respected the rights of female athletes have developed evidence-based policy through a transparent and robust process, so that World Rugby and the Sports Council Equality Group in the UK both conducted extensive consultations with, crucially, female athletes as well as transgender athletes. And I just note here that the previous Sports Council guidelines from 2013 consulted only 5 transgender interest organisations and none representing the interests of female athletes. So my second paper published last year was Female Sports Participation, Gender Identity and the British 2010 Equality Act. And it looked at the impact on female sport categories of eligibility via gender identity into opposite sex sport categories. In Britain, the Equality Act legally protects women from discrimination on the basis of sex. Section 195 upholds the legality of single-sex sports in sports, quote, of a competitive nature in which the physical strength, stamina or physique of average persons of one sex would put them at a disadvantage compared to average persons of the other sex. And that section in the Equality Act permits for the exclusion of all trans athletes, not all trans athletes, all trans women athletes, aka male, biological males, regardless of whether or not they have a gender recognition certificate. So one of the things that I think had been missed in the debate that I wanted to look at was that even today, most sports are heavily male dominated in terms of participation. So that 61% of sports participants in tennis are male, 65% in athletics, 84% in golf and rugby union, 89% in cricket, and 90% in football. And I think this is masked by how well our elite football squads do, female football squads do. And we don't realise that below that, participation in these team sports is very, very low for women. And that's before we get to political representation in the androcentric sport infrastructure, where since the male takeover of female governing bodies at the back end of the 20th century, male-dominated committees make decisions about eligibility for female categories. But despite the provisions of Section 195, many sports ignore this legal section of the Equality Act, which is dedicated solely to sport, and permit gender identity eligibility into opposite sex categories. I calculated what this might mean for female sports participation, and I used the prevalence data that we have for transgender males and transgender females, including Stonewall's estimate of transgender prevalence at 1% of the population. So a small percentage of a large male pool transitioning into a much smaller female pool makes a disproportionately large impact. In cricket and football, up to 10% of female participants could be male. In contrast, only a tiny number of male participants would be female, as you can see from these graphics. If indeed trans men and non-binary females transitioned into male categories at all, because as we'll see, this would actually mean that they take a nosedive in the rankings and they would not be competitive. So this is clearly discriminatory. This asymmetrical impact on the female category is clearly discriminatory. Female sports, where girls and women are already underrepresented, is asymmetrically significantly impacted. So I concluded that eligibility criteria based on gender identity rather than biological sex in sex-affected sports are not justified, balanced, or even possibly legal in Britain. Further, that many females do not identify as feminine, but recognise themselves as biologically female, and that they may therefore be excluded from categories based on feminine gender identities rather than female biological sex. Self-identification eligibility policies at participation levels may indirectly and unlawfully discriminate against female participation in sex-affected sports, and sports councils will surely want to ensure compliance with both the law and the updated Sports Council Equality group guidance regarding their investment decisions and the granting of public money to governing bodies of sport and other organisations. Throat's giving out a bit. Further, the Equality Act must be implemented. It's no good having it on paper without implementation. The UK Sports Councils shape the sporting infrastructure and are named in the Equality Act and subject to the Public Sector Equality Duty and Section 195. One of their overarching functions is the distribution of public money and investment in national governing bodies of sport. In 2018-19, Sport England alone invested 260 million of national lottery and exchequer funding and claimed, quote, "We will create a clear line of sight between each investment and the contribution it can make to overarching outcomes." Implementing the law requires robust policy rather than policy by litigation. The sports councils are responsible for ensuring their investment decisions comply with the law. The Sports Council Equality Group Transgender Guidelines have rightly concluded that the science shows that fairness in sex-affected sports is incompatible with self-identification into female categories. So the clear line of sight I'd like to see is that any sport receiving public investment upholds Section 195, so that all males are excluded from female categories in sex-affected sports at both elite and participatory levels. I'm going to move on now to talk a little about where we are now. But first, a quick reminder of the long fight for bodily autonomy, self-determination and recognition in sport that girls and women have undertaken. In 1912, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, founder of the modern Olympics, believed it should celebrate, quote, "the solemn and periodic exaltation of male athleticism, with the applause of women as a reward." In 1931, gynecologist Selheim believed that for women, quote, too frequent exercise will lead to masculinization. The female abdominal organs wither and the artificially created virago is complete. And then, as this slide shows, in the 1960s, there were two legendary attempts to run the male-only Boston Marathon by Roberta Gibb in 1966 and Catherine Switzer in 1967. Switzer entered by initialing her first name, and an incensed race official tried to remove her by force. Women had to wait until 1972 to be included in the Boston Marathon and 1984 for an Olympic marathon event. In terms of sports governance, in the face of women's exclusion from male governance structures, women set up their own. However, as women's sport gained recognition, men's governing bodies stepped in to administer it. So the Fédération Sportive Féminine Internationale organised an alternative Olympics in Paris, Gothenburg, Prague and London in 1922, 26, 30 and 34 respectively. But only when the all-male IAAF agreed to take control was women's athletics considered for the Olympics. So where are we now? Let's take a quick look at the sex gap in the 400-metre final at last year's Tokyo Olympics. The iconic Shawnee Miller-Uebo took gold in 48.36. But Miller-Uebo, the fastest 400-metre female runner in the world in 2021, has a time beaten by 2,047 ranked male runners. That's the sports performance-related effect of human sexual dimorphism, a 10% performance boost for males in athletics, which rises to 30% according to Sport. It's important also to note that all 8 Olympic 400-metre female finalists were black, and 5 from the Global South. All female finalists, black and white, would be beaten by males, black and white, in mixed-sex categories. So the frankly bizarre contention that single-sex categories are an imposition of whiteness and colonialism is not supported by the evidence, and black female athletes from the Global South, of course, are never asked for their views. It is against this backdrop, in terms of the history of women's sport, that gender identity theory advocates for the inclusion of trans women in female sport categories, despite the sex-linked performance gap and the research that shows that suppression of testosterone in trans women athletes only minimally affects male advantage. 3 weeks ago in Atlanta, Lia Thomas became the first transgender athlete to win an NCAA swimming championship, benefiting from huge ranking boosts from 551st, 65th and 32nd in male categories to 1st, 1st and 6th in female categories, which, after correcting for improvements, bumps 547, 61 and 13 female swimmers down the rankings. Thomas took gold in the women's 500 free, ahead of Olympic medalists Emma Wyant, Erica Sullivan and Brooke Ford, who should have placed 1st, 2nd and 3rd. Thomas was 5th in the 200 free, excluding Riley Tiltman from the finals, and 8th in the 100 free, excluding Tori Husk. Olympian Nancy Hogshead-Maker has shown how Thomas's times in female categories represent only small percentage differences as compared with Thomas's times in male categories. So that in the 200 free, Thomas's percentage difference was only minus 3.76% in the female category, whereas the sex-linked performance gap between men's and women's performances is 10.22%. The NCAA and USA Swimming cannot claim they couldn't see this coming. Thomas swam 2 nation-leading times in December in Ohio. This led USA Swimming to quickly revise its rules, but the NCAA in its wisdom decided it would not be fair to change rules mid-season. Tellingly, at the same event, trans man Isaac Hennig came joint 5th in the women's 100 free. Isaac Hennig, Olympic non-binary athletes Quinn and Alana Smith, all compete in female categories. As Hennig explains, coming out as a trans guy put me in a weird position. I could start hormones to align more with myself, or wait, transition socially, and keep competing on the women's swim team. I decided on the latter. This was wise of Hennig. Even on testosterone, trans men are uncompetitive in male categories. Why then do trans women not adopt the same strategy? Follow the lead of Samoa. In common with Olympic decathlete Caitlin Jenner, slalom canoeist Sandra Forbes, and Tour de France cyclist Philippa York, trans woman Lia Thomas could delay medical transition, transition socially, and compete in male categories. But transition from male to female categories gifts Thomas significant rankings boosts due to male advantage. And crucially, I make no judgment on Lia Thomas's motives, but the rules allow this to happen, and the rules are unfair. This exemplifies the discrimination against all female athletes inherent in gender identity eligibility criteria for opposite sex categories. It significantly boosts the rankings of trans women, males, while all females, trans men, non-binary and female athletes who identify as neither, lose rankings in male categories. This is a patriarchal sport made over for the 21st century. Gender identity ideology masks an underlying androcentric sport infrastructure where male rights and inclusion dictate the agenda. In the UK, we have our own rights clash building in British cycling. Trans woman Emily Bridges has just won bronze in the men's team pursuit and gold in the men's point race at the Bucks Track Cycling Championships. And I absolutely love this photograph, which to me represents inclusion and ensures fairness for female athletes. We've got Emily Bridges being welcomed by the teammates within that male event. But this weekend, Bridges is racing against our best female cyclists. And this year, Bridges looks set to compete in the women's category at the Commonwealth Games, bumping a female cyclist from the team. UCI rules permit eligibility for trans women on testosterone suppression to under 5 nanomoles per litre into female categories, which, as the science tells us, leaves almost all male advantage intact. Nevertheless, the rules permit Bridges to challenge our elite female supreme cyclists for the national and possibly the 2024 Olympic teams. The big question is, will Bridges beat Dame Laura Kenny, Britain's joint most decorated female Olympian, with an Olympic haul of 5 golds and 1 silver? Tactically and optically, this would be a bad idea in Bridges' initial races in the women's category. But just because a trans woman doesn't take a gold does not mean their inclusion is fair. They have still benefited from a significant rankings boost gifted them on transition from male to female categories, and displaced countless female athletes down the rankings, and possibly from national and international events finals, placings, medals, profile and sponsorship. Thomas and Bridges follow in the footsteps of other trans women athletes, including Michelle Demaresque, Cece Telfer, Andrea Yarwood, Terry Miller and 43-year-old Laurel Hubbard, who last summer bumped 18-year-old weightlifter Rovielle Detonamo from what would have been her first Olympics. All benefit from the significant rankings boosts at the expense of female athletes, and again, crucially, the rules allow it. These transgender athletes, all male, are the living manifestation of the 13 scientific studies we have, which show testosterone suppression to any level leaves most male performance advantage intact. We do not have a scientific fix to create a level playing field. Further, neither sport nor gender identity are explicitly recognised as human rights in the International Bill of Rights, although, of course, all right-minded people must surely agree that both female athletes and transgender athletes should be treated fairly. In contrast, rights on the basis of sex are referred to 47 times, plus the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women addresses the human rights of women based on sex and requires states to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women and ensure, on a basis of equality of men and women, the same rights, in particular, the right to participate in sports. So in the absence of a global government, the international sporting infrastructure, however, is largely unaccountable. And the IOC has abandoned fairness for female athletes in the now infamous Principle 5 of its new guidelines, which states, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, there should be no presumption of advantage for transgender athletes in opposite sex categories. Democratic sport governance is long overdue. Respecting the human rights of female athletes as well as transgender athletes means the right to self-determination. Female athletes should decide eligibility criteria for female categories, as they used to. Similarly, transgender athletes should decide their preferred category solutions. This must exclude female categories in sex-affected sports for both trans women and trans men taking testosterone, for fairness and safety reasons, and because female athletes do not consent. So finally, the options include, in order of my preference, 1. Single-sex categories with a focus on reforming male sports to welcome trans women, male non-binary athletes, and males who identify as neither, as in Samoa. 2. Additional transgender categories, which may be small at first, but could help build transgender sport. 3. Same-sex categories with parallel results and prizes. And 4. Open categories and dedicated female categories. I'm not a fan of 4. It's asymmetrical, and women have fought for decades for equal billing and status with men. Open and female echoes sport and women's sport. Plus, the reality is that all females, including trans men and female non-binary athletes, are uncompetitive in male categories. In conclusion then, female single-sex categories are essential to the rights of girls and women to equal opportunities and fair inclusion in sport. Including athletes in opposite sex categories via gender identity eligibility criteria is a so-called solution that does not work for females. Female athletes should not become the second sex in their own dedicated female categories, and they do not consent to this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cathy. That was great. People can show their applause. It would be helpful for me if people could raise their hands with the reaction button if you'd like to ask questions, and then I can do the right thing, which is to unmute you. So I'm looking for hands. Mary.
Thanks very
Mary
much.
Lang.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for that really informative talk. Of course, I agree with you on pretty much everything, but I wanted to just try and think my way into your opponent's side. And one of the things I hear from people who are arguing for trans inclusion in sports is, well, maybe we shouldn't have separate categories at all. Maybe it should be done on weight or height or body type, and that would be a fairer way of doing sport anyway. Do you have anything quick you'd like to say in response to that kind of argument?
Yes, I do. The evidence just doesn't hold, it just doesn't hold up according to the evidence, because when we've got sports that do have weight categories, like, for example, weightlifting or boxing, those weight categories exist within sex categories, because weight for weight and height for height, males have an advantage, still retain their male advantage over females. So if you basically got rid of sex categories and introduced weight categories, you'd have the same effect. You would have no female athletes at the top of the rankings and therefore in elite sports. So I think those arguments are put forward by people who perhaps don't understand sport.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see Vincent B, who I'll take next. See if I can unmute you. Vincent.
Hi. Your 4 choices at the end, could you elaborate on why you think number 4 is the least fair? Because to me it seems the most fair. Category 3 I don't understand. Category 2 just doesn't seem like anybody would watch that. It seems like you're creating like a group just for a political or ideological or very narrow group. 1 is, of course, I think a really good option. 4 seems fine. Could you explain why you don't like 4?
Yeah, I can. I'll elaborate on it. I obviously said a little bit about why that was in the talk. I don't know if I'm going to have a little dig here, but I think quite often men think 4 is fine, and a lot of women are. But that means it's sport and women's sport, and we've fought for a very long time for sport not to be branded as sport and women's sport. So, and I think the people that do, some of the women that do support that option, I think I'm doing some work on this actually, but some of the women who do support that option see it as a compromise option given where we are at the moment. And I can understand why that, it may well be that in the short term that is the compromise option, but I think women's compromises should be seen. And I think the reason why that's problematic is that it doesn't show the reality, does it? The reality is that if we are matching, in terms of ranking for ranking all the way down to beginner level, the open category will be a male category. It just won't be called that. And in sports where you've not got breadth and depth, perhaps you may have individual females being able to compete up, perhaps, at non-elite levels. And so those may be the female athletes who may occasionally be able to compete in an open category. But the reality of open category is, one, it's not open because wheelchair athletes, for example, in the marathon, wouldn't be able to compete in the open marathon category because they would win everything, because wheelchair marathon is faster. So in reality, I see it as a bit of a language game. Maybe it's a language game that works in the short term, but I think from a female point of view, it's kind of the proper thing, and women in the side room doing women's sport.
Thank you. I'm biting my tongue very, very, very hard. I'll take Shmuel here.
Yeah.
Shmuel.
Okay. I want to ask you how, according to you, gender inclusion in the sport can to support improvement level of the sport and of sport competitions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can gender inclusion improve? I think that was improve the level of sport, improve the level of competition in sport.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I'll have a crack at that. I probably could have said in my talk, but it seems very clear to me that sex and gender identity are two very different things. So as we know, we've got human sexual dimorphism. It's not possible to change sex. And so consequently, however anybody identifies in terms of their gender identity, that does not change their sex. So when we're talking about when you were talking about gender inclusion, I presume you're talking about gender identity inclusion. And for me, well, I think for a lot of people in sport, the whole point of having a dedicated female category is that it is based on sex, not gender identity. Okay, so it is just wonderful. As I say, I love that picture of Emily Bridges standing on the podium with those male cyclists. To me, that we could celebrate that. That would be a wonderful cultural shift, in UK society, that however you identify, however you present, you compete in your sex category, because we understand that, the underlying reproductive biology means that women wouldn't get a chance, or females wouldn't get a chance to play sport otherwise. I'm not sure we're anywhere near that yet, but to me, that's the end goal. That's where I'd like to get to.
Thank you. And now I've got Ms. J. Finkel.
Hi.
Hi.
In talking about this generally, I get a lot of feedback that people really don't understand how it could be the thin end of the wedge and lead to ultimately the end of women's sport as we know it. And as you say, disappointingly with British cycling in particular, maybe last week, 2 weeks ago, we could have put this down to an American problem we didn't have to deal with. This weekend, it's a British problem. And British cycling has always been renowned for looking for that extra 1%. And I think this time they've probably found an extra 10% in the athlete that they're putting forward. How do we then talk to grassroots sports in the UK? If I work part-time teaching swimming, very encouraging of the girls, how do I turn around to those girls and say, keep going, when our national sports bodies are not visibly encouraging them because they're going for medals and they're going for mediocre men taking our podiums?
Well, I mean, it's very, very difficult, and that's one of the problems, and that's why my second paper looked specifically at participation. And if we think back to the example of football, to have 10% of female footballers being male, really, there's no other word but farcical for that. What would that do to the participation, of girls and young women in football? Why would you participate if 10% of female athletes were males? And obviously there would be no reason why in uber competitive local leagues you shouldn't have 2 trans women or 3 trans women on each sports football participation team. And then it also leads to the to the whole issue of, if one team fields a trans woman athlete, a trans woman footballer, then the other teams, in order to be competitive, will also have to look for, or talent spot or scout, a trans woman footballer. So I think governing bodies just hoped it would go away. That was the bottom line. They just were getting pressure. They were getting lobbying pressure to include according to gender identity. And governing bodies just thought, oh, it's only a tiny problem, it'll go away. We'll never look as ridiculous as we looked last week or 2 weeks ago in the States, and as they're going to look this weekend or in the Commonwealth Games in terms of British cycling. But now it is a problem. So sadly, we've got to have an equal and opposite lobbying, exercise on behalf of female athletes.
If I can be really cheeky and follow on from that, so how hopeful are you that the inclusion of Emily Bridges in the British cycling female team will galvanise that support for single-sex, women-only spaces in sport? Do you think this is perhaps a sacrificial lamb, for want of a much better Easter kind of words? Do we need to die on this hill in order for our voices to be heard louder?
Yeah, I think with every very, very high profile case like Emily Bridges, there's that much more light shone, isn't there? And the kind of, the gross unfairness is, paraded on our TV screens, isn't it? And that inevitably will embarrass the governing bodies of sport and the sports councils who fund British cycling and have to uphold the Equality Act. And so I do think that I'm an optimist. I think it's going to change. It will not stand. But I've been absolutely shocked, to have to say, at how hard you have to fight to say, hey, female athletes have human rights too. Female athletes matter. Because I did think this will never happen in sport. Sport won't tolerate it. But I was wrong there. So it will not stand, but it's a question of how long it will take.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jay now. We've got plenty of questions, so can you keep your questions fairly brief? Thank you. Jay next.
Hi. I've thought about this issue with regards to varying sports. I can think of a couple of sports where maybe there is no need for separation of sex. I know they do this in equestrian, things maybe such as curling or shooting or archery. This might be the case. But one thing I was wondering about, the IOC left it up to the individual governing bodies to come up with regulations themselves. Here in the United States, USA Swimming, one of the regulations forces the transgender athletes to prove why they don't have the advantage. And you mentioned earlier the IOC has no presumption of advantage. What do you think about other governing bodies picking up a similar policy such as USA Swimming, where the individual athletes themselves have to prove that they're not at an advantage, as opposed to just outright banning them, or having, say, such the open category included in and getting rid of the men's category? I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, USA Swimming, because I'm a bit nervous about that. I'd like to see how that actually plays out, because, what do they mean by the transgender athlete themselves has to prove they have no advantage? I'd like to see most governing bodies, if they want to do something about this, seem to have said, oh, well, we can't go with the lower year plasma testosterone to 10 nanomoles per litre, which was the 2015 IOC policy, because that obviously doesn't work now. So now, as a compromise, we'll go with 5 nanomoles per litre blood testosterone. But all the science tells you that doesn't work either. And so our problem is that governing bodies are desperately, attempting to reach a scientific fix which isn't there. And so, unfortunately, the truth of the matter is there is no scientific fix which can undo puberty and eliminate male advantage. It can only mitigate male advantage. And if we get into the territory of, well, how much mitigation is acceptable, that's quite a slippery slope and quite a problem. And certainly from my point of view, female athletes should be involved in that discussion. or should be the people leading that discussion, because it is their category. So yeah, I mean, the IOC, you know, principle 5 is it's handed people a very poisoned chalice, because no presumption of advantage, as I said in my talk, is just contrary to all the evidence we have. All the evidence we have is that in sex-affected sports, we have to presume there's advantage, because we know there's a male advantage. And so the question has to be, how far can we get rid of that? And female athletes say you've got to eliminate it. Sometimes, you know, policy wonks say, well, we'll just mitigate it. But I don't think that's acceptable to female athletes. And I think we'll kind of be pushing, you know, pushing the levels of testosterone down to 0. And then you still don't eliminate male advantage, because testosterone has done all its work at puberty. That's the bottom line, really.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kevin, next.
So I just quickly wanted to come back to your 4 options, and I think 4, we have driven ourselves into some bad terminology by calling it open and female. And I think we should look at breaking down the categories and retitling that to sell it better. So basically we have male sex, male gender, we know where they're going. Female sex, female gender, we know where they're going. Male sex, female gender are our problem category. Female sex, male gender are not a problem category, because the minute they take exogenous testosterone, they're out. They're banned from almost all sports immediately the minute they take additional testosterone. So we're only really dealing with this male sex, female gender block. And because they're male sex, that should be the end of it. We just keep it as, we call it male and female, define it by sex, and we're back to what was always designed for sex segregated sports. The terminology and the policies and the philosophy, they've been dragged out into this discussion of gender instead of a discussion of sex. And that has allowed the other side of the argument to try and muddy the waters. And that has then forced us to come up with, well, we can't call it male and female, because then we're trans women or women, and we can't fight that because we're up against all of Twitter. Why do we not go back to just calling it male and female and arguing that it's a sex split?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. But I think there's a process to get there, maybe. I mean, I would be happy to have male and, you know, male including or plus trans women and non-binary male athletes. I don't agree with what you said about trans men, because if they take exogenous testosterone, they can get a therapeutic use exemption and compete in male categories. My point is, they are female, and an open category will not work for them, because they will not be competitive. So if we're looking to truly include, okay, all transgender athletes, we are not including trans men, because they are not competitive in open categories.
But they're choosing to move into a category where they won't be competitive. That's like me choosing to race against 20-year-olds. I'm never going to be competitive against a senior man, because I'm too old. I'm past my best.
Yeah, sorry.
If I chose to race in that category, then it's my choice to lose.
Just to finish what I was saying there, that train of thought, this is why I think it's important to look at the power gap between the sexes, males and females. So even for transgender athletes, females lose out, because trans men are female. They, in an open and female classification, have nowhere to go if they're on T. They can't go in the female category, and they're not competitive in the male category. So open and female only works for males. Okay. But
no athlete has anywhere to go if they're taking testosterone.
We're going to have to move on.
Sorry.
Much so I'd like to continue. Thanks, Kevin. I've got three more questions from Alison, Jenny, and Jess in order. So that's what I'm going to take. Thank you, Alison. Can't hear you, Alison.
Thank you very much, Cathy. That was very interesting, and I agree with the open and female. It's like on the BBC News when you see the football results and the women football results, it's that othering of, you know, the default is always male. My question really was about, I'm not an athlete, I'm not sporty whatsoever, but the reason I'm interested in this topic is because this agenda spills over into other areas of life that I am interested in. And in common with that, this is an area that I would like to do something about. So my question is really, what do we do about it? What action can an ordinary person with no sporting links do about this agenda?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and I think there's loads we can do at the moment, to be quite honest. You could start off by writing to British Cycling, and also Welsh Cycling and the Welsh Sports Council. So because I do think these policies have been driven by, you know, the nearest point of pressure, and the nearest point of pressure has been trans lobbying organisations. I mean, there are loads of transgender athletes who don't agree with competing in opposite sex categories. You know, look at Caitlyn Jenner, look at Rennie Richards. You know, lots of trans women think it's a farce for, you know, male transgender athletes to be competing in female categories. So when I'm talking about the lobbying organisations, I'm not really talking about trans athletes themselves. I'm talking about, if you like, the ideology or the discourse that has developed in this area. And as I say, I do think that is because the push has been coming from transgender interest organisations. And so as far as I'm concerned, there needs to be as big or bigger a push from people who say, hang on a minute, this is discrimination on the basis of sex against female athletes. We've got a wealth of law and human rights instruments that tell us that as a society and as a global society, we don't support that. So let's actually put our money where our mouths are and do something about it. But I think ordinary people, you know, speaking up, not feeling intimidated, not being worried about being called transphobic, you know, because unfortunately there is real transphobia, but then there is, you know, kind of a transphobia with that. If women's rights are transphobic, you know, that's a problem, isn't it? So let's keep our transphobia accusations for people who are actually transphobic, who, you know, harass and, you know, sack people who are transgender because they're transgender.
It feels like the sports issue is really like the canary in the mine to me, because it's very visible. It's a very overt, visible symbol, I think, of female oppression, where there are other examples which are less photogenic, you might say. But thank you, Cathy.
Okay, next, Jenny Smith. Hi, Jenny, you're on.
Oh God. Right, camera action. I wanted, Cathy, you've talked about the importance of women's sport and not calling it women's, it being just as valuable as men's sport, that issue. And I kind of feel perhaps we don't talk enough about how this actually distorts and corrupts the entire category. You know, a woman racing Lia Thomas or Emily Bridges is never going to know, even if she wins, she's never going to know if she genuinely won that race. When records are set, that kind of thing, it catastrophically corrupts the entire concept. And anyway, I'll be interested in your thoughts on that and what we can do about that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I absolutely agree. I mean, what it must be like to be one of those female cyclists this weekend, Laura Kenny, this weekend racing against a male, a trans woman, i.e. a male, in the female category. I mean, I think that is profoundly disrespectful to women's sports. And I'm not saying Emily Bridges is profoundly disrespectful. I know nothing about Emily Bridges. But I think the rules are profoundly disrespectful. They make a mockery of the female category. And we need to focus on the rules. I mean, I do think individual trans people can make a choice, you know, so they could say, as, you know, we don't know whether Caitlyn Jenner and, you know, would have said back then, had they transitioned, well, I better not compete in the male category. Although, to be fair, there isn't a women's decathlon, so Caitlyn Jenner couldn't have done that anyway. So, but, you know, yeah, that's what I think. I think the rules are profoundly disrespectful. I think the trans women that I admire, and a lot of them I'm linked up with on social media, are trans women who acknowledge their sex and say, but I feel more comfortable living as a trans woman, but say, but I wouldn't dream of competing in female sport categories. To me, you know, I've got an awful lot of respect for somebody who says that. So, yeah, I'm not letting individuals off the hook entirely, but my issue is with governing bodies and with the sports councils that fund them.
Yeah.
So.
Last question is from Jess. Jess, you're on.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Cathy. I enjoyed this webinar and the talk. My question is, it starts with a statement, but then there's a question. To my, you know, according to my knowledge, per what I know, many aspects of male advantage are like embedded in cells. You know, they are born with certain advantages, like you know, bone density, lung capacity, different things like that. And I guess my question and my concern, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are, is if focus on whether or not puberty is gone through and completed is actually indirectly encouraging puberty blockers, and your thoughts on that, and then the fact that it would be it wouldn't be actually addressing the issue because some of those advantages are born in the body, you know, not given through puberty. They're amplified through puberty.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yes, so there are sex differences prior to puberty, but they are very much smaller than excuse me, what happens at puberty. As you say, they're amplified plus at puberty. And I think those of us who've had kids can see that in our female and male children, you know, once they go through puberty. So yeah, puberty is, you know, an easy way, I suppose, to show the huge differences between the sexes in performance terms. And the question about puberty blockers, yeah, that is quite tricky, and I kind of like to think, but I'm not necessarily convincing myself, or started puberty, you can't compete in opposite sex categories. I'd like to think that wouldn't encourage transitioning of prepubescent children or puberty blockers in prepubescent children. I'm not entirely convinced that that's the case, because sport has a murky history of being, you know, very immoral, and, you know, in a whole range of areas. Obviously, you know, drugs and doping is one of the biggest ones, but talent spotting for prepubescent kids who you might be able to, you know, train to compete in female categories may happen. I mean, God forbid. But I think the way to deal with that, I suppose, is, and I think we're dealing with it in the UK, is to have a look at the appalling lack of evidence base for puberty blockers in the first place, in terms of, you know, what they do, whether the effects are reversible and whether that's a good thing to do to children at such a young age, rather than, well, given we know that most children who are allowed to go through puberty in their own sex resolve their gender issues by the end of puberty.
Great, thanks ever so much, Cathy. I should have maybe said at the introduction, Cathy is currently suffering from COVID, so I'm really grateful that you've been a trooper and been able to present today. That's been fascinating and very informative. Our next meeting is on the 28th of April at 2 o'clock, when Simon Fanshawe, who's one of the founders of Stonewall, will be speaking to us on the topic of his book, The Power of Difference, which it's a cracking read, and I strongly recommend it. Please make sure that you're on our mailing list so you get details of the Eventbrite website and then the link for that. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Cathy. The discussion will continue, and so will the argument in public policy to get this right. But I think just hearing about it and understanding it is a step forward towards that. So thanks very much, Cathy, again, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to close the seminar now and see you all soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.